Welcome back to The Denial Machine, Episode 7, The System Strikes Back. The Hart Senate Office Building's hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Sarah had never seen so many cameras, reporters, and spectators gathered in one place. Committee Chair Patricia Holbrook had moved the healthcare hearings to the largest available room to accommodate media interest, but even the overflow seating was filled with affected patients, insurance industry representatives, and healthcare advocates. Sarah sat at the witness table, flanked by Robert Kim and facing a panel of 12 congressional representatives. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of conversations, the clicking of camera shutters, and the occasional emotional outburst from family members whose loved ones had been affected by systematic claim denials. "The committee will come to order," quote. Chairwoman Holbrook announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 2 decades investigating corporate wrongdoing. "Today, we examine allegations of systematic discrimination in healthcare insurance coverage, specifically claims that major insurers have used algorithms to target vulnerable populations for claim denials." Sarah's stomach churned with nervous energy. She had rehearsed her testimony dozens of times with Robert Kim, but appearing before Congress felt surreal. 3 weeks ago, she had been processing routine insurance claims in a MetLife cubicle. Now she was about to testify before the nation about a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy to deny healthcare coverage to the people who needed it most. Ms. Sarah Chen, Chairwoman Holbrook continued, "You are a former senior claims adjuster with Metropolitan Insurance Corporation who has alleged that your former employer systematically denied legitimate medical claims through discriminatory targeting algorithms. Please tell us, in your own words, what you discovered." Sarah leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Chairwoman Holbrook, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. What I discovered at MetLife was a systematic conspiracy to eliminate healthcare coverage for vulnerable populations, while disguising that discrimination as routine business practice." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah walked the committee through her discovery of the priority protocols, explaining how she had first noticed the mysterious denial language in Dorothy Martinez's cancer claim, then uncovered the systematic patterns affecting thousands of patients across demographic lines. "The algorithms weren't random," Sarah explained, holding up charts that illustrated the targeting patterns. "They specifically identified elderly patients, low-income families, minorities from certain zip codes, and individuals with chronic conditions. The system was designed to deny legitimate claims to people who couldn't effectively appeal the denials." Representative Michael Torres from Texas, a Republican who had been skeptical of the hearings, interrupted Sarah's testimony. Quote, "Ms. Chen, isn't it possible that these patterns you identified were simply the result of legitimate medical review processes? Insurance companies have a responsibility to their shareholders to prevent fraudulent or unnecessary claims." Sarah had expected this question. Representative Torres, "I analyzed over 300 denied claims using the priority protocols language. Every single treatment that was denied was considered standard medical care. Chemotherapy for cancer patients, insulin pumps for diabetics, dialysis for kidney patients. These weren't experimental treatments or unnecessary procedures. They were life-saving medical interventions." Representative Torres pressed further. "But Ms. Chen, you're not a doctor. How can you determine what constitutes necessary medical care?" "Because I worked with medical review staff for 12 years. I know the difference between legitimate medical necessity determinations and systematic discrimination." Representative Torres, a 12-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez, died from diabetes complications because MetLife denied coverage for continuous glucose monitoring equipment that could have prevented her death. That wasn't a medical necessity determination. That was a corporate decision that Emma's life wasn't worth the cost of keeping her alive. The room fell silent. Emma Rodriguez's story, which Elena Vasquez had featured prominently in her Tribune exposé, had become the human face of MetLife's systematic denial practices. Chairwoman Holbrook reclaimed the questioning. "Ms. Chen, you've provided the committee with internal MetLife documents that appear to show executive-level knowledge of discriminatory practices. Can you explain what these documents reveal?" Sarah pulled out the priority protocols folder and the executive communications that Marcus Rivera had provided. These documents show that MetLife's CEO, Thomas Blackwood, personally approved the development of algorithms designed to eliminate what he called unprofitable patient populations. The company calculated that they could save $2.4 billion annually by systematically denying legitimate claims to vulnerable populations. And Ms. Chen, did MetLife executives understand that their policies would result in patient deaths? Sarah referred to her notes, quoting directly from Thomas Blackwood's internal memo. In one communication, CEO Blackwood wrote that optimal customer segmentation requires accepting certain actuarial losses in pursuit of long-term viability. When the committee requests clarification from MetLife about what actuarial losses means in the context of healthcare coverage, I believe you'll find it's a euphemism for preventable patient deaths. Representative Sarah Williams from California, a Democrat who chaired the health subcommittee, leaned forward. Ms. Chen, based on your analysis, how many patients were affected by these systematic denial practices? Representative Williams, my conservative estimate is over 10,000 patients in the past 2 years at MetLife alone. But the Tribune's investigation has identified similar practices at other major insurers. We may be looking at industry-wide discrimination affecting hundreds of thousands of Americans. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with Sarah answering detailed questions about MetLife's claim processing systems, the priority protocols algorithms, the financial incentives driving discriminatory practices, and the human cost measured in preventable deaths and suffering. But the most powerful moment came when Chairwoman Holbrook invited patient testimony. Dorothy Martinez, despite her fear of retaliation, had agreed to share her story with the committee. I paid insurance premiums for 43 years, Dorothy testified, her voice shaking with emotion. 43 years of trusting that my coverage would be there when I needed it. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer, MetLife told me that chemotherapy was experimental and unnecessary. I'm 72 years old, and they decided I wasn't worth saving. The room was completely silent as Dorothy continued. Ms. Chen could have stayed quiet and kept her job. Instead, she risked everything to help people like me. I'm here today because someone finally had the courage to expose what these companies are doing to sick people. After Dorothy's testimony, Representative Torres' questioning took on a different tone. Ms. Chen, what do you believe should happen to the MetLife executives who approved these practices? Representative Torres, I believe they should be held accountable under federal law for healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. But more importantly, I believe the insurance industry needs systematic reform to prevent this kind of discrimination from happening again. And Ms. Chen, knowing what you know now about the personal and professional consequences of whistleblowing, would you make the same choice again? Sarah thought about the media attention, the federal investigations, the corporate attacks on her credibility, the threats against her family. Then she thought about Emma Rodriguez, Dorothy Martinez, and thousands of other patients whose legitimate medical needs had been systematically ignored. Representative Torres, I would make the same choice every time. Because some things are more important than personal security or corporate loyalty. Protecting vulnerable people from systematic discrimination is one of those things. When Sarah's testimony concluded, Chairwoman Holbrook made a statement that would dominate news coverage for the rest of the week. Based on the evidence presented today, this committee will recommend immediate federal investigation into systematic discrimination practices across the insurance industry. We will also be requesting that the Department of Justice expedite criminal investigations into the executives responsible for what appears to be one of the largest healthcare fraud schemes in American history. But as Sarah left the Capitol building with Robert Kim, she knew the real battle was just beginning. MetLife had remained silent during the hearings, but their legal and crisis management teams had undoubtedly been planning their counterattack. That evening, Sarah learned how vicious that counterattack would be. At 6 p.m., MetLife held a press conference featuring CEO Thomas Blackwood and a phalanx of corporate attorneys. Sarah watched the live coverage from Robert Kim's law office, knowing that everything Blackwood said would be carefully crafted to destroy her credibility. Metropolitan Insurance Corporation has been the victim of a coordinated attack by a disgruntled former employee who violated federal computer fraud laws to steal proprietary company information, Blackwood announced to a room full of reporters. Sarah Chen was terminated for cause after she illegally accessed confidential systems and shared trade secrets with unauthorized parties. Blackwood's performance was polished and authoritative, projecting the image of a responsible CEO defending his company against false allegations. The so-called priority protocols documents referenced in recent media coverage were taken out of context and misrepresented by individuals with no understanding of complex actuarial analysis and medical review processes. Ms. Chen's allegations are not only false, they represent a criminal conspiracy to damage MetLife's reputation through fraudulent claims and stolen documents. But Blackwood's most devastating attack was yet to come. We have evidence that Ms. Chen was working with outside parties to manipulate internal documents and create false evidence of discriminatory practices. Federal investigators are reviewing this evidence as part of their inquiry into corporate espionage and securities fraud. Sarah felt the room spinning. MetLife wasn't just denying her allegations, they were claiming she had fabricated evidence and committed federal crimes. Her phone rang at 11 p.m. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Miss Chen, this is Detective Williams with Chicago PD. We've received a complaint about harassment and stalking behaviors. We'd like to speak with you about your recent interactions with MetLife employees and executives. Sarah realized this was another element of MetLife's counterattack, using local law enforcement to investigate fabricated criminal allegations against her. Detective Williams, I haven't harassed or stalked anyone. I'm a whistleblower who exposed systematic healthcare discrimination. Ma'am, we have complaints from several MetLife employees claiming you've made threatening phone calls and attempted to coerce them into providing false testimony against the company. Sarah felt the walls closing in. MetLife was using every available legal and law enforcement resource to criminalize her whistleblowing and discredit her evidence. Detective Williams, those allegations are completely false. I can provide you with phone records and documentation of all my interactions with current and former MetLife employees. Ms. Chen, I strongly advise you to obtain legal representation before this goes any further. We'll be in touch to schedule a formal interview. After hanging up, Sarah called Robert Kim and explained the latest development in MetLife's counterattack. Sarah, this is standard corporate crisis management. They're using the legal system to make you the criminal instead of them. But we have evidence, we have witnesses, and we have federal investigators who understand the difference between whistleblowing and criminal conduct. Robert, what if they succeed? What if they convince prosecutors and the public that I'm a criminal who fabricated evidence? Robert Kim was quiet for several moments. Then one of the largest healthcare fraud schemes in American history will go unpunished, and thousands of vulnerable patients will continue to be systematically denied medical coverage they desperately need. Sarah looked out her apartment window at the Chicago skyline, thinking about all the people in those buildings who depended on insurance coverage they didn't know was being systematically undermined by discriminatory algorithms. Tomorrow, federal prosecutors would have to decide whether to focus their investigation on MetLife's systematic denial of healthcare coverage or on Sarah Chen's alleged criminal conduct in exposing that systematic denial. The outcome would determine whether corporate whistleblowing was still possible in America or whether companies like MetLife had successfully criminalized the exposure of systematic wrongdoing. Thank you for listening to Episode 7 of The Denial Machine. Please find Episode 8 in the description below.